the beautiful thing about the Enneagram is that it brings up the stuff you don't want to look at, but then it brings up the stuff you actually don't want to look at. Like there's this stuff that you're like,
That's
oh,
good.
here's my dirty little secret, and then it's like, yeah, but here's the skeletons you didn't even know you had buried under your house
That's a really good
that like
point.
maggots
That's
are
excellent.
feeding on.
Well, I mean, we all know that we're on some level that we're bullshitting ourselves and everybody else. And if we don't know that, then we're really in trouble. And Enneagram at least gives you a way to see it in action.
The big hormone Enneagram.
Hi, I'm John Lukovich, sexual self-pres 4 with 5 wing, 458 trifix.
Hi, I'm David Gray, self-pres sexual 9 with a 1, 974 trifix.
What up? It's Emeka. I'm in the 8-wing-7, sexual self-pres with 854 fixes.
Hi, I'm Nancy. I am a self-pres social 3, wing 4, with a 369 trifix. If you like our podcast, guys, make sure you go like and subscribe us on the Apple Podcast app. And if you really like us, you should definitely leave us a review.
All right, so John, before you came on, we were talking about how people think that health is positive and that there's no way a type 4 could be healthy without balance and positivity playing a role in their perspective.
Right.
We need to unpack that because I think that's going to be a big one, an ongoing point of contention.
Yes, definitely agree.
And that positivity is often coming from a neurotic stance.
You know, so, I mean, we can get into it, but just to kind of preface it before we actually get into it, because it's tricky territory.
Yeah.
You know, what Emeka was speaking to, like, I'm not trying to be like woke white guy, but like, because I become so aware of socialist stuff and like class, as Emeka is speaking to, it's like a lot of white people live in a kind of, you know, upper middle class bubble where there isn't a lot of straight talk because it's like, how dare you talk to me like that kind of a quality. And so there's a lot of passive aggression and a lot of glossing over things. Like, it doesn't seem to be true for non-white people so much.
And I have a lot to say about that.
Yeah, and I think that'd be a really interesting thing. And again, like, I mean, I have to navigate, like, I don't want to just be making, as a white guy, just generalizations about racial dynamics that I don't experience directly. I experience, like, from the white culture, you know, but
yeah, I can say, at least from my perspective, what I've had to understand, especially social blind, because I think I probably would have come to understand these things a lot sooner. I mean, I'm 36, and I'm just in the past couple years fully really getting a grasp on what I believe is a huge culture clash.
Yeah,
for people who are who grew up white in this country versus basically everyone else in the world.
and it's even in other cultures, other white cultures, it's not like that.
It's not like this. It's very specific to this country, and even within this country, geographically, there's slight differences.
Definitely.
People talk about nines and like being peacemakers and things like that, but I've noticed that in Enneagram forums that the nines that speak up a lot, that have no issue speaking up a lot, they tend to be from other countries or they have some international flavor to them.
Yeah, I mean, that's like speaking to how I often bring up that nines are not conflict avoidant.
Yeah.
As a whole, like they can internalize a conflict avoidant super ego or whatever their comfort zone is. That's like that's what the 9 seeks, but it's not like just conflict itself is what the type avoids. It's like very culturally specific.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anyway, namaste and welcome to the Big Hormone Enneagram Podcast. I am one of your hosts, John Lukovich, type 4, and I am here with very special other people.
Hi,
Go for it.
I'm David Gray. I'm what am I? I'm a 9 with a 1 wing, and I am a crazy Jungian thinker. How about that?
Tasty.
Juicy.
Thank you.
Hey, I'm Emeka. I'm an 8, and yeah, I might be responsible for a lot of ruckus that you see on the internet, and that might be all you need to know at this point.
Hi, I'm Nancy. I'm a 3, and I'm just here to keep the boys in line.
Very nice. The
Yes.
Very
dominatrix.
nice.
The
Thank you.
dominatrix. Yes, I have a whip.
Yes, she has
Yeah.
a whip.
Okay, so what are
is
we
the
talking
topic?
about today, guys?
Weren't we talking about people being straight with each other? And oh yeah, we're talking about
Positivity.
positivity and the tyranny of positivity. Um,
Tyranny of American positivity.
American
Yes,
American white
positivity,
American.
positivity.
white
Yes.
positivity. So
Very
yeah,
specific.
Yeah.
Extremely.
so if you've heard other, I guess you'd say episodes of us talking, dear listener, we have talked about not a 4, which is both a kind of hashtag and an Instagram account that
A movement.
a movement that our dear sweet friend Emeka here is gently leading.
Gently.
And
With
we've
love.
all observed how 4 is the most common mistyping in the Enneagram. And it's not simply that we're interested in having people type correctly, but that we've noticed that from this mistyping comes a whole slew of misunderstandings and misinterpretations, and it opens up a whole can of worms about the Enneagram and what the Enneagram is and how people use it. And so and the account that Emeka uses, it's uses a lot of humor and memes to get a point across. But it's interesting to observe, for us at least, the responses that a lot of these sort of, like, Emeka will post something that's sort of funny and provocative, but it'll also give like a lesson about understanding type. And one of the major things that keeps coming up in response to some of the stuff that's been posted is people insisting that they are a quote healthy 4 because not all 4s are negative all the time, or they've learned to balance their negativity with positivity. And it's kind of a wrong view about what health actually is. So, from one point of view, not being stuck and locked in a certain pattern is an indication of health, but that doesn't necessarily, but attitude is not the same thing as health. What health is a measurement of, or it's describing when it's used in the context of the Enneagram, that language health and unhealth comes from Don Risso's levels of development, is levels of presence, degrees of presence, and how present we are with our psychological type, our psychological structure. And the more present we are, the less identified we are. So the more unhealthy we are, the more we're identified with the patterns of our personality, and we have no choice or space in the face of our personality patterns. So, in terms of 4, what keeps coming up is, oh, I'm an optimistic 4, I'm a healthy 4. You can be quite happy and be very unhealthy, and you can be very unhappy and very healthy. And the reason that's so is because we mistake things going well in the personality for health, when health is not a matter of personality, it's a matter of presence. And presence means the capacity to be present with whatever is emerging. So let's say that we're feeling really miserable, but we're really there, we're really in our grief and suffering. That indicates that we're healthy. If we're really unhealthy and we're very happy, all it really means is that we're not present, but we are, something is going right in terms of the way we want things to happen for our ego agenda, for our personality. So maybe we're getting a lot of positive feedback for acting out our personality type. That can vary by type. But if we're feeling really good about it, it's probably just narcissism at an unhealthy level. It looks positive, it can look healthy and great to other people, but this thing about health and unhealth is more of an inner thing, and it's not so much behavioral. Behavior can change depending on health because you're less compulsive when you're healthier, but it's not attitude. Attitude is entirely different measurement.
So positivity, you're defining as an attitude.
Yeah, feeling positive, feeling like I'm a happy whatever, a happy person.
Mhm.
And one of these responses to Emeka's post, somebody linked an article from, I guess, the New York Times that was like, people remember negative experiences much more than they remember positive experiences, which is true. And they were using this as an argument to say that I don't actually really know what they were trying to say.
The argument doesn't matter. It was just a bunch of rubbish. But she was trying to say that at a healthy level, that a 4 would be experiencing both positive and negative, and it wouldn't be leaning towards the side of negativity if they were healthy. Which it's saying that positivity is the healthier way.
She also might have been tone policing, like that's
Yeah,
to
definitely.
say, which is a common 9 thing. And so she was saying, you realize what you're doing when you emphasize the negative is you're doing this. We already have this problem
Mm-hmm.
of negativity being what we hold on to or emphasize. So
Right.
why are you doing more of it?
How would you define tone policing, and why is that a 9 thing, David? Because I agree with you.
Mm-hmm. Tone policing is, well, I think 9s are sort of in whatever environment they're in, even if it's abstract, such as being online, there's a sense of somehow identifying into the collective mood of the environment. And in a way, you almost feel some compulsion to be responsible for just bringing calm into a situation. And you think that, and the superego for type 9 thinks that, the reflexive superego response is that no good thing is going to come from any kind of anger, negativity, just irritation. Just everybody should vacuum all of that stuff out so that we can have some kind of ease together.
I was having a discussion with some folks, particularly with a friend of mine who has recently realized that she is a 9 rather than a 4.
Mm.
And one of the distinctions we were making, and she might be great to have on here eventually because
Mhm.
she's very introspective and very aware of it's opened up a whole bunch of good stuff for her, is recognizing that she's a 9. But one of the distinctions that we were making is that in this conversation was how, even though 9s will experience themselves as being very inwardly turbulent and chaotic, often, not only do people around them not necessarily experience them that way,
Mhm.
whereas they'll experience a 4 as very moody and pissy, but also that 9s, they want to offer that to people. They want to offer something soothing or
Mhm.
calming or healing for other people, even if they experience themselves as very tumultuous
Yep.
inside, whereas 4 is not really interested in offering something.
Yep.
The opposite.
Yeah, and the 4s like to kind of provoke and be a little obnoxious.
And isn't the superego thing there that you're more likely to get authenticity and truth?
Yeah, exactly. You're trying to be real, trying to provoke something to come out, and you're trying to represent something that is trying to be repressed in the collective.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
There's some interesting weird overlaps with 9 and 4 in a certain way where I think that there is a kind of attunement to the collective, but in like a fragmented way from 4. Like whereas 9 is, it got this holistic kind of view of things. 4 also feels like there's some connection to the whole or the greater,
Mhm.
but like the greater as being empty or it's like looking at the perspective of the whole from the void and trying to kind of be a voice for that emptiness in the collective somehow, or like represent that sore thumb in a certain way.
Mhm.
Do 4s feel like they are in the hole, that you're looking out from the void?
I think all 4s would relate to this, where it feels like there's been some kind of like deep, all encompassing, like on a deeper level of reality, like some kind of accident or fall or
Mhm.
like something horrible happened on like a spiritual level and nobody else recognizes it.
Mm.
That's
And
good.
I have to kind of embody it. Like
Yep.
reality is really an oil spill that's just like
Mhm.
engulfing and um, everything. It's kind of drawing everything into it and contaminating it. Nobody else sees it.
Mm,
And then with the 5 wing, there is a bit more of a, like the same way that 5 has that emptiness of concepts. It's like everything is sort of full of holes. Is that
yes.
way I
Yep.
think of it? Like
Mhm.
like there's nothing substantial. Like even my own ego agenda is not substantial, and it's like I'm so aware of where things lack or where there's gaps or where there's something not solid all the time.
One thing that's interesting in the Enneagram symbol itself is that if you look at the symbol, points 4 and 5 are by far the sharpest angle. So it's
Right.
like narrowing down into a very small point, right? And whereas 9 sits atop, a wholeness, right? So, yeah, that kind of gets at the symbolism and the difference.
Yeah, and I think what we're speaking to, that is often comes as a later realization for people when they get a sense of the Enneagram as types and the dynamics within the types, is that the symbol itself is a kind of cosmology or an
Mhm.
archetypal arrangement. And so when you can actually look at the Enneagram not just as what's type 1 like, what's type 2 like, and you start to see how the relationships around the circle are all speaking to something fundamentally true and real and archetypal, but not universal necessarily.
Mhm.
That becomes a whole thing. So yeah, like the gap between 4 and 5 like means something.
Yep.
And in the Gurdjieff Enneagram process, so when Gurdjieff taught the Enneagram, he didn't teach it as a personality system. He taught it as a way processes unfold. And they begin at point 9 and they end at point 9 in a process where something is most at risk of collapsing, most at risk of decaying or falling apart is that gap between 4 and 5, which he
Mm.
called Harnelhut, because he made up words based on Armenian and Greek and all this kind of stuff. But it's the point where and in any like real process, not just like some dumb mechanical process, but like an inner work process or something, you have to lose sight of the beginning, so you can't go back, and you have to not. You also can't know the end. It's like that point of like no orientation that you have to like surrender to faith.
That's the
Uh,
point at the gap, you're saying?
yeah, that's the
Mhm.
gap.
Mhm.
Hmm.
That's interesting.
That's
That
Go
really
sounds
back.
interesting.
so
Can't
fun.
can't go back because you crossed over. Yeah.
And you don't have a sense. You can't see the other side yet.
Mhm.
Just like over the cliff, over the suspension bridge between two poles, and you can't see either
Mhm.
side yet.
That's really fascinating. I think getting into like what the perspective of 4 and 5, what that's supposed to embody for us, I think is a good way to help people understand what that type is about.
Yeah, and
But
I think there's a lack of that in the like kind of collective awareness, of like that part of life, what that represents, and there's the tyranny of positivity where it's like things have to be good or working out or on the up, like setback. Oh, we're getting back on the train. It's like
yeah,
there's not a lot of like
Mm.
steeping in the non-rational and
Mm.
the not going anywhere kind of feeling.
years ago there was a thread in one of these forums that was kind of interesting. People were talking about, hey, do you notice that there's a difference between comedy in the US versus comedy in the UK? Just humor
Sure.
in general, and over in Europe
For
and
sure.
UK and versus America. And I think one of the things people discovered on that thread is there is at least something that people say about US culture or American culture is that this place is unrealistically optimistic. Most other places in the world are pessimistic. And so when you look at like comedy in Europe, for example, people are just far more negative and pessimistic. So it has more of that contrarian like 6-4 line
Mhm.
where there's a tragedy in these jokes that it's okay to just sit in something that's just dark comedy versus here in the states like there's a kind of like a 379 overlay where
Mhm.
you can't there's a can do ness about people's expectation of the future, that things are going to work out and this is a place where you can make things happen, and it influences the way we make jokes. And so I've noticed that I had a you guys met my friend who was living here with me, my Irish friend.
Mhm.
Yeah.
um So this is a huge thing that we discussed for a long time because he had sort of a culture shock, and in a way, he helped me figure out what this was, and just our sense of humor as non-Americans or originally non-Americans was clashing a lot of times with American sense of humor, which just doesn't get that negative. And I feel like it's a huge aspect of what's going on in the Enneagram world. It's just this cultural overlay of optimistic positivity that it's very American.
You know, I think because the context of a lot of Enneagram stuff is a sort of self-help view that it is about how to get better. And there is something optimistic in the archetype of self-help because it's like, I'm going to help
Yes.
myself. And it's interesting because, you know, you get into mysticism, which the Enneagram, like from self-help can quickly lead to. And not all of it, but a lot of it it's about like dying before you die. It's quite like about being completely helpless and powerless to affect anything because you're so trapped in the prison. You know, so there's this sort of, in a sense, similar aim, like a similar orientation, but like completely different view of it.
Hmm. That's one thing I've always liked and respected about the Enneagram is there's a lot of typologies and self-help modalities, but I hadn't found anything that, at least I guess, says a lot about me that I was attracted to this, but it was showing me all the different ways that I sucked. all, all the things that were holding me or habitual patterns that weren't good. And I mean, I've seen Enneagram descriptions that have tried to put a positive spin on type patterns. But I mean, in some of the earliest Enneagram texts are kind of negative, like Naranjo's book, the way that he tried to line up
Right.
the types with these pathologies, like they weren't good.
Totally. That's a good point.
I think a lot of people for them that was an introduction to the Enneagram, and for
Well,
me, that was like, who else is talking about something so terrible as a personality structure like this?
I hadn't thought about it, but yeah, that's a good point because like it could be like, oh, you're an INFJ, you're the pioneer, explorer, seer,
Yeah.
depth, you know, and it's sort of congratulating you, and I think that's part of the point, just to get people into it, is to like flatter them.
Hmm.
And Enneagram is least effective and least interesting when it's, you know, we know it from the miserable Instagram memes that it just like so boring and useless when it's just congratulating people where they are, because I think we all recognize that we're not the way we should be. There's something else about us that needs to be brought into being, and that we, as a collectively, we don't know how to do that.
Yeah, I was talking with my therapist, and she was saying she's learning the Enneagram. She's been through a few trainings, and she said the beautiful thing about the Enneagram is that it brings up the stuff you don't want to look at, but then it brings up the stuff you actually don't want to look at. Like there's this stuff that you're like,
That's
oh,
good.
here's my dirty little secret, and then it's like, yeah, but here's the skeletons you didn't even know you had buried under your house
That's a really good
that like
point.
maggots
That's
are
excellent.
feeding on.
Yeah, I've had some experiences over the years just naively thinking that people would be excited about new methods of typing that were more accurate, or they would be excited about ways that would help them accurately land on their type. And oh, like, let me help you see this thing that you've been, because that's where I was thinking, oh, I was so excited that you could even do this, that you could even identify in a very concrete way what someone's type was. And I recognized that it was almost like people were being forced to face themselves in a nightmarish kind of way. And I've seen people like break down or block me and completely like, we're talking about friends that I've known for years, that through the Enneagram, that once it came down to a typing of them that was spot on and described them, but also in a way just like ruined whatever idealized fantasy that they had of themselves. It was like a morning I saw multiple times where people just dropped the Enneagram completely, left, because of an awakening that happened that they did not want to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like viscerally uncomfortable when you actually learn your type and get into it. So not fun.
It should be. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, definitely. It should be horrifying
Yeah.
because like you're only going to leave your prison if you're horrified by the prison.
Mhm.
Sorry, what were you
Most of the
saying?
time. Oh, I was just gonna say that's what attracted me to it. I was like, yes, give me all the darkness.
Darkness of 3.
Yeah, we can still do it.
Oh yeah, no doubt.
I was really attracted to the idea that you could learn one thing that could completely rearrange your whole self concept. Like make you just sit there and think about your entire life for days and weeks. And I was really like the first few years I was into it, I was just peeling back the layers of bullshit that I was thinking about myself. And that process of peeling back the layers of your self delusions is there's something really cool about that.
Oh yeah.
It completely shocks you.
Well, I mean, we all know that we're on some level that we're bullshitting ourselves and everybody else, and if we don't know that, then we're really in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And Enneagram at least gives you a way to see it in action. And yeah, I mean, my attraction, I think I've talked about on here before, is like I was fucking horrified thinking I'm unique to find something that describes my personality completely, like completely accurately, that fucking hundreds of millions of people must.
There's a billion
Also-
other unique people.
Yeah, millions of other unique people on the planet. It just
Ooh.
terrifying. So then it was like,
Hmm.
what can be me? It's not just in a book.
One thing I found kind of fascinating when I was in the narrative training was how each type does this to an extent where they can take the Enneagram and pretend they're doing self like inner work, and like that can become their crutch. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
How so?
Yeah, so like in the case of like twos, I feel like do it really. They can kind of say, oh, I'm creating more positivity in myself. I'm doing this inner work to make myself better for these other people. And it just sort of becomes a process where they don't dig any deeper because they don't want to become any more negative.
Mm.
Yeah, everybody can use the Enneagram to do a brand new version of your type neurosis.
Yeah. And they lean on the Enneagram as like, no, I'm not doing it. So it becomes even harder to kind of get past that because they believe they're doing inner work, but it's not inner work.
Right.
Because they're doing it in like this positive neurosis. Yeah.
So yeah, like a healthy two is a two that can be really shitty.
Yeah.
And own it,
Exactly.
but also like not just be shitty because no one appreciates them, but just like because they're
A human.
complicated.
Yeah. Mixed
Yeah.
hearts.
Yes, exactly. That's a
Yeah.
good way to put it. Well, would three be using it as a self-improvement project?
Oh yeah. Yeah,
Mhm.
definitely. You can just get sucked on into that and be like,
Mhm.
oh, I'm working so hard on myself and like this is my new project and here's a goal, but like self-help never can have a goal.
Right.
Like your work cannot have a goal. It's impossible. So the actual inner work is like way more terrifying than the actual three wants to go.
Yeah, like framing the outcome limits the outcome.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah. And there isn't always like a positive outcome.
Right.
Sometimes it's just sad as shit.
Right.
I was going to say some more things about the cultural angle.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I used to think it was just an American thing, but it's also cultural. I think I was saying something earlier how it is very specific to white culture,
Mm-hmm.
and even within white culture, there's some variation between like East Coast versus West Coast. I'm in the Midwest, so this is like the
The
epicenter.
worst.
Yeah, the epicenter of passive aggressiveness, and I've just learned in the past 2 years what is going on. So I was part of the show. You guys know that I was part of the show called Easy on Netflix,
Great
and
show.
yeah, it's a great time capsule of what I'm talking about. And I started calling this thing, I call it the easy syndrome. because this show, if you've ever watched this show, then you know what I'm saying. To me, my experience of the show when I first watched it was this show's annoying, and I didn't really know why it was annoying because it's very well done. It's very authentic to this part of the world. But I started to realize that it's annoying because I don't understand why people don't actually say what they mean. A lot of the show is people talking around each other, and there's a lot of passive aggressiveness from my perspective. Where let's say a couple is having a fight or an argument, it starts off with this indirectness, passive aggressiveness, that if another couple from another culture, a black couple or a Mexican or whatever, were having a similar fight and things like that were being said, there would be pots and pans being thrown.
Mhm.
Like the level of intensity would be completely different. So that show was educational for me because it was the first time that I really could see this is an actual culture. I didn't grow up this way. people, my friends who are white, sometimes say that I'm so blunt. I used to think that that was because I'm an 8, but I mean that's partly because, but it's really cultural.
Mhm.
Most white people aren't used to being told what's what, straight up from most people that they encounter. Like I notice when some white people get into certain other subcultures, they start to pick up on that subculture's way of relating, which is definitely not that. Like I know like a lot of white dudes that end up in hip hop subcultures who become much more blunt and straightforward because they're around a lot of non-white people in that subculture. So I've come to understand that this is a big cultural difference. It's a huge difference in just how much negativity or upfront potential conflict a person is used to dealing with. And that's all it is. What did you grow up with and what's your range of what you're comfortable with? And I think most white people just didn't grow up in an environment where they were told what people thought.
Yeah, so I married an Italian woman. And I mean, in Italy, it's much more straight. It's not confrontational, I would say, but it's more straightforward. And so, one of the like ways I tease Ilaria, she says something to me, and I just go, "Oh," like I've been wounded, but in Italian accent. And Italians are always sort of like fighting with each other, but it's not like the drama is real, but it's not threatening.
Hmm.
And
Right.
so I used to like when we started fighting, I thought there was like a real problem. And now Alara will just be like, "Oh, what did you be?" And I'm like, "Oh, and it's just how I've learned a lot and become much more straightforward from it. But I
Mhm.
agree that American white people, I mean, even and British, I'd say,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Irish are
Mhm.
much more straight up, but
yeah.
British and Americans have a thing, and having become more interested in class and socialist politics and the viewpoint, the lens of class. I'm not, I don't. It's not clear to me, but I do feel like that there is something in the mix there of our history of class and race that this kind of indirectness and not being straightforward became normalized. And I don't know exactly what it is, but like in America, it's very rude to talk about how much money you make. And part of what that does is it keeps people from knowing how much their coworkers are making, and therefore, creating solidarity to actually renegotiate their salary with their boss, so that it's considered either like a mark on somebody's worth when it's really a matter of how much the boss is exploiting somebody or not.
I have
Yeah.
some thoughts on that because I've had some late nights thinking about this, like how this is a culture. So how does this culture develop and how does it just become the thing? And one thing that I realized, or having these conversations with my friend, my Irish friend, he said, what you realize is that most people who have had to deal with straight talk is because they didn't have the luxury of not dealing with reality
Mm,
because they were coming from a place where they were put in a less than position at some point. Which, if you're, for example, if you're Black in America, at some point, a parent of yours or someone elder of yours is going to have to sit you down and tell you that you might experience some unsavory things with police or whatever. Like, there's going to be some straight talk because
Mhm.
if you're a person of color, you don't have the luxury to be in denial of what's going on because that's just what you're going to have to deal with.
Mhm.
yeah,
So,
that makes a lot of fucking sense.
Yeah.
culturally, basically, you talk about Irish people versus British people. Irish people were conquered at some point.
They were systematically starved.
Yes. So you hang out with Irish people. They're hilarious. They're fun. And they have an interesting sense of humor, and they can talk shit about themselves. People are constantly shitting on themselves because when you've been put in a situation where you are at the bottom, you develop culture and sense of
Mhm.
humor and an honesty, self-honesty about where you are because you don't
Mhm.
have any choice. Whereas when you are in a position where you're subjugating other people, you're invested in not being real about what you're doing.
Yeah,
In order,
that makes so much goddamn sense. Like if
Yeah.
and if you're a boss, like you're not supposed to bring up how they're exploiting people or how their life or values are actually hurting people.
Mhm.
There's no straight talk allowed.
Right. So I've noticed that, especially with a lot of the stuff that's going on in America with white men that are angry about not feeling like, I don't know, society gave them what they were somehow unconsciously believe that they deserved based on how much society tells you for white people that they're on top. And so some people feel frustration about that. And a part of that is just in that culture anyway, no one is telling you straight up that what you think is going on isn't actually going on. Whereas if you're a person of color, there's not a whole lot of delusion here to tell you that you're better than you are. Actually, it's the opposite. People of color have to be realistic about what's going on. There's not the luxury of deluding yourself. Whereas if you are of the dominant culture, then there's a lot of self-delusion. There's a propaganda that's specifically there to make you feel better about your position, whether or not that's true or not. And so that's a big reason why I think a lot of white people don't experience straight talk, is because the culture inherently is built on not being real about what's going on.
Yeah, and I think what trips people up, white people up, when this kind of conversation comes up is a lot of white people will be like, "Well, I wasn't as privileged, or like I struggled or was poor or something like that," and blah blah blah. But it's like, yeah, but it's still in the culture.
Mhm.
It's still in the culture, and the word privilege is kind of getting old for people now, like
Yeah.
like having think pieces on privilege. But it's always important to remember that privilege is not that your life went really well or is supposed to go well, but that like you being the person you are based on race and gender and sexuality was not a detriment to it was not an addition to all the suffering you're already experiencing.
Mhm. At the end of the day, there's a lot of white American culture is invested in sort of a passive delusion. It's built into the culture here, and people are avoiding real conversations about things. Even if you want to talk about racism, you notice how people don't necessarily want to talk about that because it's an objectively negative thing, and it actually happened. So there's a way that you want to sweep that under the rug. Let's not talk about this terrible thing that happened, or how that might be foundational to the fabric of the country that we live in, or not even like black people, just but Native Americans and all these terrible things that have taken place. Let's not have a real conversation about that. Whereas if you're on the other side, if you're of a culture who was at some point subjugated, you never had the luxury to not talk about what was really happening. Like you
Mm.
had to be real about your shitty situation. So I feel like that's a major aspect of 'cause I wonder if in other countries they have the same sort of or positivity bias, because it's really noticeable to me here. Like just dealing with people online in Enneagram forums, it's incredible to me that 90% of the people don't want to have any real conversations or any negative toned conversations about the types.
Yeah, well, I think in addition to that, Americans come from a background of people that were like gonna make it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like in Europe, like in Ilaria, in Rome, it's fascinating to me how I will notice that we're able to like move between social classes in the United States pretty fluidly. Like I don't make much money, but somehow I'm like at a place with a lot of wealthy people or something very exclusive, and then I'm with another place not like that on the opposite end of the spectrum. Meanwhile, in Italy, it's like the classes don't interact as much. Like it's like because the money has been in their families for generation. Because there wasn't that like, all right, at least some of us are going to start a new thing in a new place and kind of figure shit out. It's like it's been like resources have been distributed to different families and classes in the way they've been distributed for like centuries in a lot of cases.
Hmm.
But also, so there's that kind of immigrant quality of like we're gonna start some shit here, but also something I've been thinking a lot about and not sure how to, like, I don't have a clear vision about it yet, but how much personality is, in one sense, personality is a mechanism for taking care of our instinctual resources, and that extends to the role of personality as something that secures our social class. And like an example of that kind of was like so obvious, but also kind of blew my mind was I remember I went to a conservative Catholic, very competitive private high school, and I remember there were just so many kids whose whole personality was about getting good grades and looking good on a college application. And years later, I can look them up online or see them and how fucking boring they are and how they did it right, but there's like nothing else in them, and that's because their whole personality was just about getting good grades, which means maintaining social class.
And self-preservation job.
Yeah. You could argue what's a stronger pull, but yeah,
Mhm.
self-preservation job and money, and the way that's tied in with social class.
Yeah.
It blows my mind how much of people is just that.
Yeah. And when you add in the kind of social class view of like, if you want to live a happy, healthy life, you should work harder to get a better job so that it pays more. Like, there's this classism of, you should be able to get a better job, but yet we need all the jobs.
And then, as Emmett is speaking to, like, denying the reality of like the way the fucking world is, because then you have to question like why there are billionaires and why things are distributed the way they are, and that's really uncomfortable, everybody.
Super uncomfortable,
John,
but
do you
real.
John, do you remember that book that I think I recommended to you called Class?
I never picked it up.
Okay. It's an interesting book because class isn't something that people talk about in the US, but is very apparent everywhere else, especially like in Europe. Like you talked about how resources get consolidated with certain families. And here, what's really cool as an immigrant is that there's the air that anyone can come here and you can take your family to wealth and fame and
Mhm.
fortune. But what it does, that sort of American
Wait, that's not true.
like this American propaganda is sort of hiding the fact that we do have a class system here.
Definitely.
And that's another aspect of, I feel like as an outsider looking in, that there is what they tell you about America and then there's what is really happening. And it feels like people here are invested in the fucking American dream, whereas everyone who is actually trying to make it on the bottom recognizes that this shit isn't real. It's
The American dream is fake.
not
Yeah,
real.
and part of the reticence that like politicians and then donors and all those kind of people, they have a hard time acknowledging that, because then it means that their success isn't justified.
Yes.
And it doesn't mean they're as a good or effective person as they think they are, and that it's not like a not character that makes them successful. And in fact, if things are the way that they actually are, meaning classes about stratification and exploitation in a lot of cases, then they have to own that in fact they're not as good as they thought they were, or effective people or better people, but that actually they're just in some cases unconscious assholes.
Yeah. Or they were just lucky.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Cause one thing that I noticed with a lot of successful people, sometimes you'll see successful people who continue to harp about, I work so hard and just hard work. How did you get here? Hard work. And I mean, make no mistake, you do have to work hard, but there are a bunch of people working their tails off who will never even get close to
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
a fraction of what they achieved. So it's what they're doing is they're saying that because on some level they understand that you got lucky. I mean, you have to work hard to give yourself the opportunity, but hard work doesn't mean a goddamn thing in terms of whether or not you're going to become massively successful.
It's also the crossover between being a morally slash ethically good person, and hard work, and just all of those things. You know how those overlap in people's minds, and so then you're supposed to be deserving of something because of that and so on. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, what kind of a mega successful person would be able to say, "Yeah, I mean, I work hard just like every fighter, and I got a lucky break, so yay luck." They're not going to say that because like you have to pat yourself on the back on some level.
Mhm.
But yeah, culturally, it feels like everything here is meant to progress to a better place. This is what America is supposed to. This is what how things work in America. You get here, you start at level 1, you go to level 2. If you're not at level 3, what are you doing? You need to work harder. It just that's the pervading sense. I don't know if that exists
Well,
anywhere else.
yeah, like you know how like so like with Sanders wanting to like forgive student loans or whatever, and then people like, oh well, it's not fair to people who work their ass off to pay off the student loans. Like, which makes no
God.
fucking sense. But it's like it's sort of like if a lot of the metrics by which Americans measure success were to go away because of different policies of ways we distribute money or resources or whatever, if they were to change, then it'd be like, how do I know then I'm a good or worthwhile person? Like if the
Mhm.
if the levels game was taken
Mm.
away, what would what would I have to pursue or achieve? There's a little bit of that outrage of like,
Mhm.
how would I know I'm good or
Mm,
whatever it is?
Yeah, because I feel like being a good person is kind of tied, like weirdly intertwined into being a successful,
Mhm.
like a stereotypically successful human.
Yeah.
Like they're like, oh, well, if you are a good person, eventually you'll catch a break. It's like that's not always true. And so, kind of stripping away that like belief system of if you're good and you do the right thing, you will eventually catch a break. It freaks people out because then that means not everyone's going to catch a break and you might just be poor forever and you might end up homeless.
hmm
Yeah.
That's real talk.
And
And
then just
and it
negative.
and it comes back to this whole thing. I think when you look at people's, it's sort of an American drive for self-help and how people look at the Enneagram as a self-help modality. So this Enneagram is supposed to help me improve and become a better person. And being a better person has to be positive, right?
And it has to make me more successful, right?
We all
Yes.
know the cultural archetype of the most good and successful small business owner, which was Jesus Christ. And as Jesus became better and better, he opened more franchises and hired more employees and
Built more houses.
built more houses, and that's
The
the
model.
the
Expanding.
Yeah.
gospel,
Ever expanding.
prosperity
There's-
gospel.
Yeah.
Getting back to the tyranny of positivity, I feel like that's a good background of where all that is coming from. I think most Americans, most white Americans, their approach to the Enneagram is that this is supposed to make me better, and health is going to put me in a more positive place. And so there's a way that they want to delete and make for into being a positive type, or at least a type that has balance, because why would you be negative? How is negativity going to help me live my best life?
It might also tie into, maybe this is a white culture thing also, is the intellect is master,
Mm,
and so if I read about myself, if I read about my type and I have a mental understanding of it, then that's at least roughly equivalent or maybe 50% of the actual change.
Mm,
what?
that
Good point.
I mean,
Good
that
point.
makes no sense and makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Right.
That's
Like the
absolutely what people
logic.
think.
Yeah, that's what people think, and yeah,
Oh, yeah.
totally.
Hmm.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
absolutely how people treat it. They read one
Totally.
description and they're like, I've got it.
No, I've
And the-
seen
and-
people post that. I've been reading this stuff and now I know about it, and so I'm not going to do it anymore. Just
Oh my
automatic.
God.
Oh, yeah, no,
Yeah.
no, totally. Yeah, it's like
Yeah.
the first impression I have based on my first reading is like forever. That's my sense of the Enneagram.
Right.
Mhm.
And this applies to everything, but the Enneagram is just
Yeah.
It's so true. Well,
When it-
it's like that. It's like that. I think it's like a bell curve chart or whatever, but upside down. Like you start out at I know nothing, and then you go to I know everything, and then you go to I really know nothing,
Yeah.
and then you start realizing what you don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is so much more useful.
Yeah.
Yep.
So you got to get past
Yep.
that first hump.
it seems like here there's a very polite veneer on how fucked up things are. That people are shocked when the shadow gets brought up. Like there are a lot of people that were shocked at what happened with the last election, whereas the shadow, people don't have the luxury of ignoring the shadow in most places in the world. And so I feel like that's culturally what's going on here is that people are highly invested in not looking at any of the dark stuff or any of the negative realities of what life is like here in reality. And that's how people approach the Enneagram. It's like not confronting the real shit about what's going on about their types. And so that's why four can't be what it is. Four can't be loss and emptiness because that's so anti-American.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Another
Yeah.
another fucking example of this is like I went to Paris last winter. They're still doing the yellow vest protests against, I guess, austerity and Macron,
Mm.
and they're fucking shit up. And one of the interesting things about the United States is that we love nonviolent protests, which I'm all for, but we think nonviolence means non-destructive. And like sometimes in a protest, you got to destroy property. When it becomes any kind of property is threatened, people call it a riot. That's like a thing here where it's like, oh, well, that's out of bounds. That's impolite. It sort of neuters any kind of effect that those kinds of, whether we're talking inside ourselves of being able to really contend with our own shadow, or we're talking externally in terms of a certain kind of effective confrontation with the forces that we're actually dealing with.
Yeah, it's interesting that this stuff is going on with the two types that represent the shadow, and it seems to me that in order for people to be confronted with what four and five to a degree actually is, that they have to be provoked. Like it is a provocation to actually see four for what it is, because that means that you have to admit that there is a shadow, that there is a type that's organized about bringing that to the surface. And so for people to actually see four accurately, they themselves would have to be a little freaked out that this is a reality that I'm completely ignoring. I don't even want to think about.
Yeah, the balance there needs to be. That's my compulsion is to, as a 9, is to bring the balance, which is in this case to really press people's noses into the ugly of 4
Yes.
and 5, right? I mean, just
Yeah.
really, there's literally these memes of people. I've got my pumpkin pie spice and my
Yes,
whatever,
blanket.
and I'm a 4.
Coffee.
Pumpkin pie
Dog.
spice.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, wow.
One more time. David just said pumpkin pie spice
Yeah.
instead of pumpkin spice.
No, yeah, I don't know the spices.
You might have just aged yourself.
Yeah.
It was cute. It was endearing.
There was a 4.5-hour video on David Lynch, the Twin Peaks, which was a good demonstration of sort of a 9 perspective. And basically, to sum up that whole 4.5-hour video that I actually watched, the whole show, the whole point of Twin Peaks is that it's a meta criticism of television. And he's trying to point out that television is unbalanced, that it shows violence without the depth of feeling that comes with understanding the impact of what like a murder would do to a town. And so what Twin Peaks is supposed to do is to slow things down so that you can actually feel the impact of violence. And then because most TV shows just kind of hit you with the violence and then moves on to resolve who done it so that you can forget about it and move on.
Or
And
point at the
so
bad person and then that's it.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like to actually come face to face with evil, with darkness. So you see a lot of that show, or even just David Lynch in general, is that he wants to put your face in the shit that sucks, but also soothe you with some positive, dreamlike, to ease. So it's want to restore a balance to television, and that Twin Peaks was the antidote to getting us to slow down, to not look for a resolution to the mystery, to actually care about this Laura Palmer. So it's interesting that you say that
yeah.
To restore balance, because I mean right now we're heavily tilted to, at least the Enneagram world is heavily tilted towards just making these types into a positive thing. So people are like, why are you being so negative? Why are you because that's what's necessary. This is a perspective that is unacknowledged and being swept away and swept under the rug. And people need to actually know that 4 and 5 are not positive types, and we actually need that perspective.
Yeah, it's not that 4 and 5 are like as types that interesting or special or better or whatever. They're just like any fucking other type. But there is like a lack of the view or an understanding or incorporation of what it represents archetypally. And I mean, we're in late fall now, going into
Winter.
Thanksgiving and Christmas. And I find so interesting is other countries have this, but like that celebrate Christmas, but like American Christmas is like, first of all, it's just a celebration of capitalism. It's all about lights and happiness and excitement, and it's like we bring that even into the holiday that in other countries, I mean, even in Italy, it's still got a little bit of a kind of a solemn darkness to it. It's got like a reflectiveness and
That's interesting.
and is it Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement in Judaism, or was
I
that
think so.
Jewish tradition has this Day of Atonement and it begins fall, and it's like it's this day of making room for. It's not just I need to redeem myself, which again has that archetype of getting better, but it's that day of being with and steeping in and reflecting on and introspecting on where one is at, and owning the different fragments of oneself. And we try so hard in this country to also make it a light thing, make it a positive thing.
Can't get enough Christmas lights.
Yeah, that fucking music.
I would gladly put my Christmas lights up all year round if Brian would let me.
See how you are?
You're the
part of
problem.
Yeah.
I am. I love me some Christmas.
I like New Year's Eve the best. I had a great appreciation for it. I didn't really care about New Year's Eve before until I started working at this bar, and I started to see. I didn't know that New Year's Eve is such a big deal for a lot of people, that they would dress up, come all the way out from the suburbs and buy tickets to this New Year's Eve event at this bar that I was working at, and people would pay like $50 and everyone would be decked out. And my favorite part of New Year's Eve is, of course, before the countdown at a place like that, the balloons come down and that music, the really nostalgic music, starts playing, and couples start kissing. And the most tragic thing are the people who aren't coupled up. And even for the people who are coupled up, it's like the weight of the entire year. For that 1 minute, people have started to consider their life and how disappointing that year might have been. And collective sadness is so thick. And especially, it's a little bit more tragic if, like there's a girl by herself and she's not like making out with anybody. And like, there's nothing more tragic than that, I don't know, 5 minutes.
Emeka will help out.
I was about to say that.
So that's why New Year's Eve has become my favorite holiday. It's just like, I've never felt people are just collectively forced. Like the delusions drop for just a few minutes. Like
there's a condensed 5 minutes.
Yes. Where you are faced with the suck, and maybe you're trying to drown it in alcohol or some new, pussy or dick or whatever it is that you got to do to counteract this feeling. But I love that. I love that, for just a few minutes, people are confronted with the emptiness of existence.
The void.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good point. We do we have a pretty good Halloween, like other countries don't do that. And it's like when I was at preschool substitute, we were reading little kids, like 3-year-old kids and 4-year-old kids, about like skeletons and all this stuff, and like really pretty fucked up shit. And they were like loving it, and I was like, this is great, like there's a place for that. So like we have something of it, but it's not very inward.
Yeah.
It's a character flaw that they are blind to in themselves and the characters they create. The heroes and protagonists of the literature and films reek of the same oversight. An uncharacteristic value that if they saw it would instantly deepen and broaden their perspective. It was the flaw and blind side of privilege and power. The intelligence that could be weeded out by the type of comfort one would choose to prolong or protect. An heirloom. I watched shitty movie after shitty movie thinking how could they not see this until it dawned. This was the floor they worshipped.